Well, let's discuss all of this with Evie Aspinall, Director of British Foreign Policy Group. Evie, thanks so much for joining us. So how significant is this trip by the Foreign Secretary to China? Does it mean that relations have thawed, already began to thaw, or are we still some way away from that moment?
I think we're still quite a way away from them thawing as such, but I definitely think this is a positive step in the right direction in terms of a warming of relations. We've seen many of our allies. The United States has sent 3 senior officials in recent months. France and Germany are doing the same. This is the first step you actually see quite a lot of Western nations now taking towards a thawing of relations with China that have deteriorated so rapidly in recent years, particularly because of COVID, but also Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong. The last few months are kind of the first steps towards kind of an improvement of relations again.
To what extent was the relationships getting worse, and now this trip even taking place, just a case of us following the United States lead?
I think the United States' trip has definitely opened the door. I don't think China would have been particularly bothered about seeing the UK. It's not one of the biggest partners for China on the world stage. They're a big partner to us, but less so in the other direction. The United States going has definitely opened the door for the UK to do so. And it does mark quite a big change. A lot of the rhetoric that we've seen, for example, under Liz Truss, about talking about designating China as a threat, has already gone. And you really do see under Sunak a greater willingness to cooperate with China. It's seen to be an important partner that we do have very fundamental differences with. The importance of cooperating is seen to be to overcome that and to be more important than that.
So if the UK and the US sort of share a sort of similar view here towards China, what about continental Europe? Because even if Janet Yellen and Secretary Blinken and now James Cleverly have had trips to China, they have been amid tensions, whereas President Macron had quite a high-profile, almost celebratory state visit quite recently.
Yes, and Macron's visit had kind of faced a lot of backlash, particularly in Europe, because he was very, we shouldn't be led by the United States, we should do what is right for France. And there's quite a lot of backlash within Europe to France's visit. But in practice, many other states have started to follow suit. And I mean, Europe has a real challenge that actually the Central European Commission is very anti-China. It's been going clear in its stance, but actually you've got so many member states who all have very clear, particularly economic interests in engaging with China, that Europe really struggles to create a cohesive policy on China, and each state really will go and do whatever it makes most sense to, like Macron going off and offering quite a lot of concessions and try to build those economic links with China.
There's obviously a need with countries of this size to be practical to some extent. But James Cleverly said in an interview with our Helen Ann Smith this morning that he's raising human rights abuses in every single meeting. I mean, it then raises the question to us, if you're raising it in every single meeting but continuing to discuss things, is that not at the same time saying to China, yeah, we'll talk about it, but we're not really that serious about these sorts of things? And whether it's buying gas and oil from Middle Eastern states, whether it's potentially inviting Mohammed bin Salman here, are we in a new stage here of practical approaches by the government rather than principled approaches?
I do think that the government's really trying to push this narrative of kind of robust pragmatism. And the idea behind that, and this idea is another one, is patient diplomacy, lots of buzzwords. But kind of the principles behind these is that we should engage with lots of nations, regardless of whether we believe with their domestic values, what they're doing domestically, how their domestic populations see their governments. We should engage with them, bring them with us to our values, and also to cooperate with them economically, particularly post-Brexit, where we really need to be forging these partnerships. That's the current government stance, and I think we see that in a lot of the focus on the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing quite a lot of engagement with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and here with China as well. I think the UK government is adopting an approach which is very much partly economics driven. There will always be values in there, as we're seeing with Cleverly, and that's partly being driven by his own party. There are very strong China hawks within the Conservative Party, pushing him to be very forthright on human rights. But at the same time, I do think the UK government is being led by a practical need on an economic level, and also on addressing the big challenges like climate change. China is a massive player. If we want to tackle these issues, we have to take China with us.
More broadly, this was perhaps more a question for the US than for the UK, given that President Biden has imposed some pretty effective sanctions on China in recent years. But how careful does the West need to be about boxing China in, particularly as their economy does slow in part because of Western sanctions, but for all sorts of other reasons as well. Is there a risk of punishing them too much in the short term and boxing Xi Jinping in personally?
I do think what people are very cautious of is, that, while we were connected economically to Russia, we are much more economically dependent on China. Sanctions on China will be much, much more crippling on the UK economy and the West in general. People are very cautious of overly boxing, as you say, China into one position and making them into a rival. And I think that's partly why we've seen, as China's opened up again post-COVID, mainly this year, we're seeing an increasing willingness to cooperate with China, because otherwise we'll push them into one corner and then we're stuck. And actually economically and in terms of security, that'd be very damaging for the West.
Evie Aspinall, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.